Claude responded, "My name is Claire Hendricks, and I have been Senior Director of IT Security Compliance at Mercer Valiant Financial Group for 3 years. My name is Claire Hendricks, and I have been Senior Director of IT Security Compliance at Mercer Valiant Financial Group for 3 years." The morning Gerald Koss walked into Conference Room B on the 14th floor, he was carrying a leather portfolio embossed with his initials and wearing the particular expression of a man who has never once questioned whether he belongs in a room. I recognized his name on the visitor manifest before the receptionist finished logging him in. He did not recognize me at all. He looked through me the way people look through glass, registering surface, registering light, registering nothing underneath. I was standing at the head of the table with my compliance binder open to page 47 and a federal auditor on my left, and Gerald Koss, the man who had told me I was paranoid, neurotic, and professionally embarrassing, sat down across from me and smiled the smile of someone who expected to be rescued. My documentation changed everything. He had no idea that the file folder I was holding, the one with the blue tab and the date stamp reading March 4, 2 years prior, contained every vulnerability report he had dismissed, every email thread in which he had CC'd the entire department to mock my concerns, and every system log I had quietly exported and preserved across 6 months of silence, while the organization drifted toward exactly the kind of exposure I had warned him about. He had no idea because he had never, not once, taken seriously the possibility that I was right. That was his first mistake. His second mistake was walking into that conference room believing he was there to manage the situation. He was not there to manage anything. He was there because the federal audit team had specifically requested the presence of all current and former members of the compliance chain, and someone in HR had noted on his exit paperwork that he had served as my direct supervisor during the relevant period. The auditor opened her laptop. I opened my file. "Hello, everyone. Before I continue, if you have ever been told that you were overreacting, that your concerns were not worth taking seriously, that you needed to stop being so difficult by someone who was supposed to support your work, leave a comment below. I want to hear your story. Because what I am about to tell you is not just about one audit and one conference room and one man with a leather portfolio. It is about 6 years of building something in complete silence while the people who dismissed me had no idea what was accumulating, and I want you to understand all of it from the beginning. To understand why that morning meant what it did, I have to take you back. 6 years back. I was 29 years old and I had just been passed over for a promotion I had been working toward for 2 years. That was not the betrayal. The betrayal was the way I found out. I had been working at Cortland Systems Integration as a mid-level security analyst for 4 years. I was good at the job, not in the modest, self-deprecating way people sometimes say they are good at things, but genuinely, demonstrably skilled. I had flagged 3 separate intrusion attempts in 18 months, all of which were later confirmed by external review. My documentation practices were meticulous. My incident reports were cited by the Internal Audit Committee as models for the department. I had applied for the senior analyst position when it opened, submitted a 12-page portfolio of my contributions, and received a confirmation email from HR that my application was under review. What I did not know was that my supervisor at the time, Gerald Koss, had already decided who was getting the position before the application window closed. I found out from Marcus Webb, one of the network engineers, who mentioned it in passing near the coffee station on a Tuesday morning, the way people mention things they assume everyone already knows. He said, "Oh, they're announcing Derek's promotion Friday, didn't you hear?" Derek Paulson had 3 years less experience than me, had never authored a vulnerability report, and had submitted a 2-page application that Marcus, somewhat apologetically, described as pretty thin. I smiled at Marcus and said I must have missed the memo. I walked back to my desk. I pulled up the shared drive and looked at Derek Paulson's file access permissions, and I noticed for the first time that they had been updated to senior analyst level 4 days earlier. The announcement had not been made yet. The promotion had already been finalized. I requested a meeting with Gerald the following morning. He kept me waiting 22 minutes past the scheduled time. When I finally sat down across from him, he had a coffee mug that read "World's Okayest Boss," and the particular posture of a man preparing to be patient with someone he finds tiresome. I asked him directly why I had not been selected. He said, and I want you to understand that I am recalling this with the precision of someone who wrote it down the same evening in a document she titled simply, GK, Record of Statements. Claire, I think you're a solid analyst. But honestly, you're a little paranoid. The way you write up these reports, the level of detail, the frequency, it makes people uncomfortable. We need someone with a lighter touch. I asked him to define paranoid. He said, you flagged the Meridian vendor access last quarter as a critical vulnerability. It turned out to be nothing. I said, it turned out to be nothing because I caught it before it escalated. He said, that's one way to look at it. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I asked whether there were other concerns about my performance. He said no, my performance was fine, it was more of a cultural fit issue. I asked whether cultural fit had been a documented criterion in the promotion process. He shifted in his chair and said, look, Claire, I'm trying to give you feedback so you can grow. Don't make this into something it isn't. I thanked him for his time and left his office. That evening, I went home and looked at my savings account, which held $11,400, the entirety of what I had managed to set aside over 4 years of analyst-level salary in a city where a one-bedroom apartment consumed 41% of my monthly take-home. I had been counting on the promotion. The salary increase would have been $22,000 annually. I had already done the math on what it would allow me to do: finish my Certified Information Systems Security Professional exam, which I had deferred twice because of the exam fee and the study materials cost, and begin building the kind of credential record that would eventually open doors Gerald Koss did not have keys to. $11,400. And a document on my personal laptop titled GK, Record of Statements. I opened a second document that night. I titled it Vulnerability Log Personal Archive. I wrote the date at the top. I wrote down the 3 vendor access anomalies I had flagged in the past 6 weeks that had not made it into the official incident report system because Gerald had told me to use better judgment about what rises to the level of documentation. I folded a piece of paper that night with the name of a certification program written on it. I put it in my wallet. I kept it there for 4 years. The month after Derek Paulson's promotion was announced, I submitted a lateral transfer request to the infrastructure audit team within the same company. Gerald approved it without comment. I suspect he was relieved. I suspect he thought the situation had resolved itself tidily, that I had accepted the outcome and adjusted my expectations accordingly, that the paranoid analyst with the uncomfortable reports had found a quieter corner of the organization where she would stop creating friction. He was not wrong that I had stopped creating friction. He was entirely wrong about why. In the infrastructure audit role, I had access to system logs across 3 of Cortland's major client environments. I was not looking for anything specific in those first weeks. I was learning. I was building a map of how the organization's security architecture actually functioned versus how it was documented, and the gap between those two things was, to put it charitably, significant. I kept my observations in my personal archive. I did not raise them internally. I was not yet in a position to raise them in a way that would be taken seriously, and I had learned, with precision and at some cost, what happened when I raised things that were not yet ready to be taken seriously. I applied to the CISSP program that November. The exam fee was $699. I had been setting aside $40 a week from my paycheck since August, in a separate savings account I opened for the purpose, which I labeled in my banking app with a single word: architecture. I passed the first section on the second attempt. The failure on the first attempt cost me an additional $240 in re-examination fees that I had not budgeted for, and I remember sitting in my car in the parking structure near the testing center looking at my bank account on my phone and feeling the particular sensation of a plan encountering reality. Not despair. I want to be precise about this. Not despair, something closer to recalibration. I sat in that parking structure for 45 minutes. Then I drove to the library, checked out 3 additional reference texts, and built a new study schedule around the sections I had underperformed. Marcus Webb called me 3 weeks after I transferred to infrastructure audit. Not for any particular reason, he was the kind of person who called to check in, one of those rare people whose attention is not conditional on what you can do for them. He asked how the new role was. I said it was interesting. He said Gerald had already replaced me on 2 of my previous projects with a contractor who, in Marcus's words, seems confused about what a firewall does. I thanked Marcus for telling me. He said, You know you were right about the meridian thing, don't you? Like actually right. I said I knew. He said, someone should tell him that. I said, someone will. I meant it. I was not certain yet of the precise shape of how it would happen, but I had stopped being uncertain about whether it would. The second section of the CISSB exam, I passed on the first attempt. My manager on the infrastructure audit team was a quiet woman named Priya Subramaniam, who had been with the company for 11 years, and who had the rare quality of recognizing good work without requiring that it be performed loudly. She assigned me to the quarterly access control review for the Hartwell client environment in my third month on the team, which was not a routine assignment for someone with my tenure in the role. The Hartwell environment was complicated, a legacy system architecture with 17 distinct permission levels, and a series of vendor integration points that had been added incrementally over 6 years without a comprehensive security review. Priya handed me the project folder and said, I'm giving you this because I think you'll actually read all of it. I read all of it. I spent 4 weekends on it. I produced a 61-page access control report that identified 9 distinct vulnerability points, 3 of which I classified as critical, meaning they represented active exposure risk rather than theoretical future risk. Priya read the report over a weekend and sent me an email at 7:43 on a Sunday morning that said simply, "This is excellent work. I'm going to recommend it goes to the client directly." It went to the client directly. The client, a regional insurance carrier called Hartwell Benefits Group, implemented 7 of my 9 recommendations within 60 days. The 2 they did not implement were the 2 that required the largest capital expenditure. 14 months later, a competitor of Hartwell's suffered a data breach through an almost identical vulnerability type to the 2 Hartwell had deferred. Hartwell's executive team came back to Priya and asked who had written the original access control report. Priya sent them my name. I was not in a position yet to leverage that recognition fully. I was still a mid-level analyst on an audit team, still working through the remaining sections of my CISSB credential, still keeping my personal vulnerability archive updated with observations that had not found their way into any official report. But something had shifted. I had a name attached to a piece of work that had been vindicated externally, and in security work, vindicated documentation has a particular kind of permanence. I did not tell anyone in my personal life about the Hartwell report. The people I might have told, the few family members I was still in contact with, the cousin who had once told me that computers were a dead end for someone without a technical degree, the uncle who had asked at a holiday gathering 2 years prior whether I had thought about something more stable, like accounting. None of them were people I trusted with the information that I was, slowly and deliberately, building something they had told me was not possible. My cousin Renata had said it at that holiday gathering with the particular confidence of someone who has never seriously attempted anything difficult. She had said, I just worry about you, Claire. It is so male-dominated. You're fighting a battle you can't win. She had meant it kindly. That was the version of dismissal I found hardest to absorb, the kind wrapped in concern, the kind that presents itself as love while functioning as a ceiling. I had smiled and asked her about her kids. Later that evening, I updated the personal archive on my phone, adding the date and a single notation. RH, battle you can't win. I kept records of everything. Priya Subramaniam left Cortland Systems Integration 16 months after the Hartwell report, taking a director-level position at a firm called Audit Consulting Group. Before she left, she did something I did not expect. She wrote me a formal letter of recommendation and placed it in my personnel file without being asked. She told me about it in passing, almost casually, the way she did most things. She said, I put something in your file. Use it when you're ready to move. I was not ready to move yet, but I kept the letter in mind the way I kept other things in mind, filed, dated, available. The CISSB credential came through on a Thursday morning in October. I was at my desk when the email arrived. I read it twice. Then I closed my laptop, walked to the break room, poured myself a coffee I did not particularly want, and stood at the window looking at the parking structure for approximately 4 minutes. The credential had taken me 2 years and 8 months, 4 separate examination sections, 1 failed section and its retake, $1,120 in fees and materials, and more hours of study than I had counted because I had learned that counting hours created a kind of pressure that was not useful. I had a CISSB. I was now, on paper, qualified for roles that Gerald Koss was not qualified for. I went back to my desk and updated my personal archive. Not my resume. I updated my resume 2 weeks later, carefully, after I had researched the market for senior-level security positions. I updated the archive first, because the archive was where I kept the things that were true regardless of whether anyone else acknowledged them. I applied to Aldenvin's consulting group 6 months after Priya left Cortland. She had mentioned, in one of her occasional check-in emails, that there was a senior security architect opening on her team. The application required 3 professional references and a portfolio of documented security work. I submitted Priya's letter of recommendation, the Hartwell Access Control Report with the client's permission, and a reference from the chair of the Infrastructure Audit Committee at Cortland, a man named Thomas Birch, who had signed off on my quarterly reviews for 2 years, and who had told me once, during an exit interview I conducted for a departing colleague, that my documentation practices were the clearest he had seen at this level. The Aldenvin's interview was conducted by a panel of 3 people. Priya was one of them. The other 2 were Aldenvin's head of client services, a man named Raymond Chu, and the firm's external security consultant, Dr. Felicia Morrow, who held a PhD in information security from Carnegie Mellon and who opened the interview by placing my Hartwell report on the table and saying, "I read this on the train this morning. Tell me how you identified the 3 critical vulnerabilities." I told her, in detail. I had been telling that story to myself in preparation for 6 months. They offered me the senior security architect position at a base salary of $114,000 annually, plus a performance bonus structure, and a contribution to a health insurance coverage plan that was the most comprehensive I had ever been offered: full medical, dental, vision, with coverage for specialist appointments, and a dedicated HR contact for navigating insurance policy questions. I accepted the offer on the phone and sat in my car for 20 minutes before driving home. I did not tell Gerald Koss. I submitted my resignation to the infrastructure audit team manager, a man named Doug Heffernan, who wished me well and asked if I had any feedback about the team. I said the team was good and that Priya Subramaniam had been the best manager I had worked under. He wrote that down. I cleaned out my desk, returned my access badge, and walked out of Cortland Systems Integration on a Friday afternoon in April without telling anyone except Marcus Webb, who gave me a brief, sincere hug and said, "He's going to figure out eventually that he made a mistake." I said, "I know." Marcus said, "You're not going to be there when he does." I said, "That's the point." At Aldenvin's, I found the environment I had been building toward without knowing its exact shape. Priya ran a team that operated with the rigor and the autonomy I had been trying to exercise at Cortland, while being told I was doing it wrong. Dr. Felicia Morrow, who served as a senior advisor to several of Aldenvin's largest clients, became something between a mentor and a professional anchor, the first person in my career who had both the stature and the inclination to take my work seriously at its full value. She introduced me to an attorney named Daniel Reyes, a partner at the firm Whitmore Reyes and Associates, who specialized in corporate compliance and regulatory risk, and who became a resource I would eventually consult on matters involving documentation standards, legal disclosure obligations, and the particular question of what an individual employee's liability is when they have formally flagged a compliance concern that has been dismissed by their direct supervisor. That last question became relevant sooner than I expected. My second year at Aldenvin's, I was assigned as the lead security architect on a federal compliance review for a financial services client, a mid-sized investment advisory firm called Brenton Capital Advisors, which managed approximately $340 million in client assets and which had recently been flagged by a regulatory body for potential deficiencies in its data security infrastructure. The engagement required me to produce a comprehensive security audit covering 12 months of system access logs, vendor integration records, and incident documentation. The work was the most complex I had undertaken to that point, and it surfaced a set of findings that the client's own internal compliance team had not identified because, and this detail matters, they had not been keeping the kind of records that would allow those findings to surface. I had kept that kind of records my entire career. The Brenton engagement took 11 months. When we presented the final report to the client and the regulatory body simultaneously, In a conference room in downtown Boston in February, the regulatory representative asked me directly how I had identified a particular configuration error that had been present in the system for approximately 26 months. I told her I had followed the access log trail backward from the point of exposure, which required documentation going back further than the client's own archive retained. I had supplemented the client's records with vendor-side documentation that I had specifically requested and preserved during the audit engagement. She asked whether that was standard practice. I said it was my standard practice. She wrote something down. After the presentation, Priya found me in the hallway and said, "That question she asked you, that's going to matter." I said I thought so too. Priya said, "You should talk to Daniel." I called Daniel Reyes the following morning and described the exchange. He said, "You're developing a professional reputation for documentation that goes beyond what the regulation requires, in ways that have already proven useful. That's a significant asset. Make sure you understand what you have." I understood what I had. Raymond Chu promoted me to Director of Security Compliance 8 months after the Brenton engagement closed. The promotion came with a salary adjustment to $141,000, an expanded team of 6 analysts reporting directly to me, and a formal title change, Director of Security Compliance, Aldenvance Consulting Group. I was 36 years old. I had been a compliance analyst 7 years earlier, dismissed as paranoid by a man whose own documentation practices I would have flagged as a medium-severity vulnerability. I did not call Renata. I did not send a message to anyone in that circle of people who had watched me begin this path and offered their assessments of its likelihood. I went to dinner alone at a restaurant I had been meaning to try for 2 years, ordered something expensive, and sat at the bar reading the industry journal that had just published a brief profile of Dr. Felicia Morrow's work in regulatory compliance frameworks. My name appeared in the 4th paragraph, in a single line, as a contributor to her recent work on documentation standards for federal audits. One line, in a journal that perhaps 2,000 people read. It was enough. For then, it was exactly enough. The following year, I was recruited by Mercer Valiant Financial Group for the role of Senior Director of IT Security Compliance. The headhunter who contacted me was a woman named Joanna Park, who said she had been given my name by 2 separate sources, one of whom was Dr. Morrow and one of whom was the regulatory representative from the Brenton engagement, who had apparently mentioned my name to a colleague at a conference. Joanna described the role: oversight of the entire compliance infrastructure for a firm with 912 employees, and regulatory obligations under 4 separate federal frameworks. She said the previous senior director had left under circumstances she described diplomatically as a breakdown in documentation culture. I asked her to be more specific. She said the firm had received a preliminary inquiry from a federal audit body regarding discrepancies between their reported security posture and their actual system configuration. I said I would be interested in hearing more. The interview process took 8 weeks and involved 6 separate panels, a written assessment of a hypothetical compliance scenario that I was told no previous candidate had completed in under 4 hours, and that I completed in 2 hours and 19 minutes, and a final conversation with the firm's general counsel, a woman named Harriet Osei, who asked me a single question at the end of our meeting. If you identified a critical vulnerability and your direct supervisor dismissed it, what would you do? I looked at her for a moment. Then I told her, in precise detail, exactly what I would do because I had done it before and I had the documentation to prove it. Harriet Osei said, "When can you start?" I started on the 1st of March. I spent the first 90 days conducting a full audit of every compliance record the firm had produced in the prior 4 years. I found gaps. I found inconsistencies. I found documentation that had been filed but not maintained, records that existed on paper but not in the access-controlled archive, and one incident report that had been formally closed without a resolution log, meaning, in practical terms, that if anyone ever asked whether the firm had known about a particular system configuration issue, the paper trail would suggest they had not. I created a parallel archive. Detailed, time-stamped, cross-referenced. I kept it on a secured personal drive that was not part of the firm's primary network. I did this not because I was hiding something, but because I had learned, at Cortland, under Gerald Koss, What happened to documentation that lived only in places controlled by people who might prefer it not to exist? By the end of my first year, I had rebuilt the firm's compliance infrastructure from the record level up. 6 months before the federal audit inquiry arrived, I had flagged 4 systemic vulnerabilities in a formal report that I submitted to Gerald Koss, who had joined Mercer Valiant as IT director 3 months after my own start date. A coincidence that I registered with the precise neutrality of someone who has learned to treat irony as data, and he had sent me a reply email on a Tuesday afternoon that read, "Claire, thanks for this. I think you're overcomplicating things again. Let's revisit in Q3." He CC'd the head of operations and the firm's CFO. He used the word overcomplicating. He did not use the word paranoid this time, but the structure was identical. I saved the email, I printed a copy. I filed it in the blue-tabbed folder with the date stamp. Then I continued building my archive. She had no idea what I had become. None of them did, and I had every intention of keeping it that way. The federal audit inquiry arrived on a Wednesday morning, addressed to the firm's compliance department, requesting a full production of security documentation covering the prior 24 months, with particular attention to records of known vulnerabilities, and the firm's documented response to each. The inquiry specified a response deadline of 14 business days and noted that the audit team would be conducting in-person interviews with current and former members of the compliance chain. The head of operations called me at 8:47 that morning. I let it go to voicemail while I finished the organizational index I was building for the production package. When I listened to the message, he said, and I have the voicemail still, saved to a cloud account I control independently, "Claire, we've got a situation. We need to talk about what documentation we actually have." I called him back and told him that I could have a complete, indexed, cross-referenced production package ready within 72 hours. There was a silence on the line. Then he said, "You already have it." I said I had been maintaining it continuously for 14 months. Another silence. He said, "Gerald is going to need to be part of this conversation." I said, "I know. Tell him conference room B Thursday, 10 a.m. That Thursday morning, Gerald Koss walked into conference room B carrying a leather portfolio embossed with his initials. I was already at the head of the table. The federal auditor, a woman named Sandra Payach from the Office of Financial Institution Examination, was on my left. My production package, 183 pages, indexed, tabbed, with a digital copy on an encrypted drive that had been verified by the firm's outside counsel, was open in front of me. Gerald sat down. He looked at the package. He looked at me. For the first time in 6 years, something crossed his face that I did not have a word for immediately. It took me a moment to identify it because I had not seen it directed at me before. It was recognition. Sandra Payach said, "Ms. Hendricks, I'd like to begin with your vulnerability report dated March 4th, 2 years ago. Can you walk us through how this document was created and what action was taken in response to it?" I had come that close to everything surfacing before it was time, but it wasn't time yet. I looked at Sandra Payach. I looked at the report. I thought about a piece of paper folded in a wallet, a parking structure on a Thursday afternoon, a Sunday morning email that said simply, "This is excellent work." I thought about Marcus Webb saying someone will tell him and me saying I know. I thought about $11,440 a week in an account labeled architecture, and a journal that 2,000 people read with my name in the 4th paragraph. I thought about the blue tab on the folder in front of me, and the date on the first page of what Gerald Koss had called paranoid, and I placed both hands flat on the table. Then I began to talk. Claude responded. Sandra Payach had a particular way of asking questions that I had noticed in the first 4 minutes of our interaction. She paused after each one, not in the... Sandra Payach had a particular way of asking questions that I had noticed in the first 4 minutes of our interaction. She paused after each one, not in the way that people pause when they are waiting for an answer, but in the way they pause when they are measuring the distance between what they asked and what they expect to receive. She had asked me to walk her through the vulnerability report dated March 4th, 2 years ago. She had paused. Gerald Koss was sitting across the table with his leather portfolio open to a blank page, his pen held in the manner of a man who had decided to look engaged without committing to anything in writing. I walked her through it. Not quickly. I had been walking through that report in my mind for 14 months, rehearsing not in the anxious way of someone who fears a test, but in the precise way of someone who wants the telling to be accurate, to be unassailable, to leave no gap through which an alternative interpretation could enter. I described the discovery process, the access log anomaly I had first identified on a Monday morning in February, the vendor integration point that had been modified without a corresponding change control record, the 3-day sequence of cross-referencing I had done before I was confident enough to write the first draft. I described the draft review process. I described the email I had sent to Gerald Koss on March 4th at 9:17 in the morning, which was flagged in my archive with the subject line, Critical Vulnerability, Action Required, and which had received a reply at 2:44 that afternoon reading in its entirety, Claire, thanks for this. I think you're overcomplicating things again. Let's revisit in Q3. I placed that email, printed and tab-indexed, in front of Sandra Payach. She read it. Then she looked at Gerald. Gerald's pen had stopped moving. She said, Mr. Koss, can you confirm this is your response to the March 4th report? Gerald said, I'd want to review my full email record before confirming any specific correspondence. Sandra Payach made a note. I turned to page 12 of the production package, where I had included a screenshot of the email as it appeared in the firm's archived server record, with the metadata intact. Sender, recipient, timestamp, and the IT administrator signature that confirmed it had not been modified since the date of transmission. I had asked Harriet Osai, the firm's general counsel, to certify the metadata verification 2 days before the audit meeting. Harriet had done so and signed a declaration that was attached as Exhibit C. I placed Exhibit C beside the email printout. Gerald's expression did not collapse. I want to be precise about this. There was no dramatic moment of visible crumbling, no movie-style recognition of defeat. It was smaller than that, and in its smallness, more complete. His eyes moved from the email to the exhibit to the production package, and then to a point somewhere above and behind my left shoulder, which was the specific visual behavior of a man realizing that the geometry of the room was not what he had assumed when he walked in. Sandra Payach said, Ms. Hendricks, I'd like to take a short recess to review the additional materials. I have some follow-up questions for both of you. I said that was fine. I closed my production package. Gerald gathered his portfolio and stood. As he moved toward the door, he paused near my chair and said, quietly, not for Sandra Payach's benefit, I think, but from some reflex older than strategy, you've been planning this for a long time. I looked at him. I said, I've been documenting it for a long time, that's different. He went out. The door closed. I sat alone in conference room B for 11 minutes, which I know because I counted them. I did not feel triumphant. I want to say that clearly because I think people sometimes expect a story like this to arrive at a moment of pure uncomplicated satisfaction, and that is not what I felt. What I felt was something more like the sensation of structural completion, the way a building feels when the last load-bearing element is set in place, and the whole thing becomes, finally, what it was always designed to be: solid, finished, stable against whatever came next. I felt that. And then Sandra Payach came back and we continued. The audit process unfolded over the following 6 weeks, and the details of that process are not mine to disclose in their entirety. There are institutional boundaries and confidentiality obligations that I take seriously because they are the same kind of obligations that, when violated, produce the exact vulnerabilities my career has been built on identifying. What I can tell you is that my production package was accepted by the audit team as the primary compliance record for the review period. What I can tell you is that the 4 vulnerabilities I had flagged in my March 4th report were each specifically cited in the audit findings as known risks that had been identified internally and not remediated. What I can tell you is that Gerald Koss's employment at Mercer Valiant Financial Group concluded by mutual agreement 14 days after the audit team's preliminary findings were issued, and that the separation terms were handled by Harriet Osai's office with a thoroughness I found professionally satisfying. What I can also tell you is that the evening after Gerald left the building for the last time, Harriet Osai stopped by my office and placed a single document on my desk, a formal commendation from the firm's executive committee, signed by the CEO, citing my compliance work as having materially protected the organization from regulatory action. She said, "You know you saved this company a significant amount of exposure." I said I knew. She said, "How long were you building that archive?" I said 14 months here, about 6 years before that in other forms. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, let's talk about your contract renewal. But that is not where the story was, not entirely. Because Gerald Koss was the surface layer. He was the person I had seen most recently, the face that was easiest to name when someone asked me about dismissal. What I had not yet told you, what I need to tell you now, because it is the part that cost more and lasted longer, is that Gerald Koss had not been the first. The first had been my own family. Not in the way of a dramatic estrangement, not in the way of a single betrayal that you can point to and say, there, that was the moment. It was accumulated. It was the particular kind of damage that does not announce itself, that presents as concern, as love, as reasonable doubt about your judgment. My mother, Carol Hendricks, had never raised her voice at me in my life. She did not need to. She had a way of framing her doubts as questions. Are you sure that's realistic, Claire? Have you thought about what happens if it doesn't work out? That accomplished everything a raised voice would have accomplished without leaving any surface evidence of harm. My brother David Hendricks was more direct. David was 3 years older than me, had gone into commercial real estate at 24, and had built what he described as a solid, practical life, in a way that left no ambiguity about what he considered the alternative. He considered me the alternative. When I told the family, at 29, that I had been passed over for a promotion I deserved and that I was going to pursue the CISSP credential and eventually move into a senior compliance role, David said at the dinner table with our mother and our Aunt Renata present, Claire, you've been in IT for 4 years and you're already hitting the ceiling. Maybe that's information. I said, maybe it is. He said, I'm just being honest. I said, I know. I did not say anything else. I helped clear the table. I drove home. I opened my personal archive and wrote the date, and under the date I wrote, DH dinner, maybe that's information. I did not write what I felt because what I felt was not relevant to the archive. The archive was for facts. What I did not know at that dinner table, what I had no reason to know, was that 11 years later, David Hendricks would be sitting in a conference room of his own, with an attorney present, because his commercial real estate investment property had encountered a financing crisis that had cascaded into a broader financial disclosure problem, and that the resolution of that problem would require the cooperation, and specifically, the financial participation of every member of our family trust. Our family trust, which our father had established before his death, with a trust document that named 3 equal beneficiaries, David, me, and our mother, and which had been administered for 8 years by a financial advisor named Grant Kowalski at a firm called Elliston Wealth Partners, and which contained, as of the date David's financing crisis became apparent, approximately $417,000 in combined assets. David had not told me about the trust's existence until 11 months before the crisis. He had mentioned it, briefly, at a family gathering, our mother's 62nd birthday, held at her house, which is a detail I remember with precision because I drove 2 hours to attend and was back in my car 2 hours after arriving. He mentioned it the way people mention things they are not quite comfortable mentioning but feel obligated to acknowledge. He said there was a family trust, it was administered by Grant Kowalski, and I should probably have the contact information in case anything comes up. He handed me a card. I put it in my wallet next to the folded piece of paper that still had the CISSP program name on it, even though I had completed the credential years earlier. I kept the paper because it reminded me of what it had taken to begin. I called Grant Kowalski the following week. He was pleasant and professional. He explained the trust structure, the beneficiary allocations, the distribution schedule, and the investment strategy. Emailed me a copy of the trust documents, 26 pages, drafted by an estate attorney named Warren Chu at a firm called Chu and Blanchard, who had been retained by my father 18 years prior. I read all 26 pages on a Saturday morning. I noted 3 provisions that seemed, to my non-legal reading, to contain ambiguities about what required unanimous beneficiary consent versus majority consent. I did not raise those observations immediately. I filed the documents. I added a notation in my personal archive. I called Daniel Reyes, my attorney from Whitmore Reyes and Associates, the following Monday and asked whether he handled trust and estate matters. He said his primary practice was corporate compliance, but that his firm had a dedicated estate attorney, a woman named Patricia Lim, who was excellent. I asked him to make an introduction. He did. Patricia Lim reviewed the 26 pages I sent her and called me back within 48 hours with a careful, measured assessment that confirmed my reading of the ambiguous provisions and added 3 additional concerns she had identified that I had not. She said, "I want to be clear, these may never become relevant, but it is good that you are aware of them." I said I preferred to be aware of things that might become relevant before they became relevant. She said, "I noticed that about you from the documents. For the next 18 months, nothing happened with the trust." David's commercial real estate business operated in the way such businesses operate, with a particular kind of visible confidence that I had learned, in my compliance work, to read as a surface condition rather than a structural one. The investment property he had leveraged most heavily was a mixed-use development in a secondary market that had performed well for 3 years, and then encountered the kind of vacancy cascade that secondary markets sometimes produce when their anchoring commercial tenants exit within the same 18-month window. The financing structure David had used involved a personal guarantee backed partly by his share of the family trust. I learned this detail not from David, but from a phone call I received from Grant Kowalski in October, 14 months after my initial conversation with him. Grant said, in the careful tone of a financial advisor delivering information he is not certain how to characterize, that David had been in contact with him about a restructuring discussion related to the trust, and that, as a beneficiary, I would be receiving a formal notice within the next 2 weeks. I thanked Grant for the advance notice. I called Patricia Lim within the hour. She said, "Forward me whatever you receive, don't sign anything until we've spoken." I said I had no intention of signing anything before speaking with her. She said, "Good. I didn't think so, but I wanted to say it." The formal notice arrived 11 days later by certified mail. It was a letter from Warren Chu at Chu and Blanchard, the same estate attorney who had drafted the original trust documents, informing me that David Hendricks, as managing beneficiary, was requesting a trust restructuring that would, among other provisions, allocate a larger share of the trust's liquid assets to cover obligations related to his investment property, with a corresponding reduction in the reserve allocation for the other beneficiaries. The letter used phrases like temporary reallocation and anticipated recovery timeline and in the best interests of the overall trust value. It included a signature page. I did not sign the signature page. I scanned the letter and emailed it to Patricia Lim at 9:43 that evening. She called me the next morning and said, "Warren Chu is a competent attorney. This letter is written in a way that makes this seem more routine than it is." She walked me through what the restructuring would actually mean in practical terms. My beneficiary share, which represented approximately $139,000 of the trust assets under the current structure, would be reduced by an amount she calculated at between $62,000 and $84,000, depending on how the anticipated recovery provisions were interpreted. She said, "Your mother's share would be similarly affected." I said, "My mother has signed." She said she signed last week. There was a pause. She said David may have been counting on that. I called Patricia Lim that evening. I signed the first document, not the signature page from Warren Chu's letter, but a retainer agreement formally engaging Patricia Lim as my estate attorney with full authority to act on my behalf in all matters related to the family trust. There was no going back. The weeks that followed had a particular texture that I find difficult to describe accurately because the closest word is patience and patience implies waiting, and what I was doing was not waiting. I was building. Patricia Lim requested the full financial disclosure history from Grant Kowalski, which he was obligated to provide to all beneficiaries, and which he provided promptly and completely, because Grant Kowalski was a man who understood his fiduciary obligations with a clarity that Warren Chu's client apparently did not. The disclosure revealed that David had made 3 requests to Grant over the prior 14 months to draw from the trust's liquid reserves, each framed as a loan to be repaid, each approved by Grant only with our mother's signature, each totaling amounts that had not been disclosed to me as a beneficiary in any formal communication. The 3 amounts totaled $67,400. Patricia requested a formal accounting from Chu and Blanchard. Warren Chu's office acknowledged the request and asked for 30 days. Patricia said she would allow 15. During those 15 days, I gathered every document I had. The original trust documents, the financial disclosure history, the 3 loan request records, Grant Kowalski's correspondence, my own archive notation from the evening David had first mentioned the trust at our mother's birthday party, and a financial analysis Patricia had commissioned from a forensic accountant named Dr. Sonia Alvarez at the firm Alvarez and Reed, whose written assessment concluded that the proposed restructuring would not, in fact, produce the recovery outcome described in Warren Chu's letter, and that under a realistic market projection, the trust's assets would be further reduced by an additional $31,000 to $45,000 within 24 months if the restructuring proceeded as proposed. Dr. Alvarez's report was 42 pages. I read it on a Sunday. I had read longer. David called me on a Tuesday afternoon. I was between meetings, standing in the hallway outside my office at Mercer Valiant, still in the period before the federal audit had arrived, and said he wanted to have a family conversation about the trust before things got complicated. I said I was available for a conversation. He said he hoped I wasn't going to make this into something adversarial. I said I wasn't making it into anything. I was responding to a formal legal notice that had been sent to me as a beneficiary. He said, "Come on, Claire, it's family." I looked at the wall in front of me. I thought about a dining table and the phrase, "maybe that's information." I thought about 26 pages of trust documents read on a Saturday morning and a notation in an archive and Patricia Lim saying she had noticed something about me from the documents. I said, "I know it's family, David, that's why I hired an attorney." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "We're scheduling a meeting for the 23rd. I'd like you to come in person." I said I would be there. He said, "It would mean a lot if you came ready to be reasonable." I said I would come ready to be accurate, which in my experience was close to the same thing. That was the moment I understood exactly how much they had underestimated me. The meeting on the 23rd was held in the conference room of Chu and Blanchard's offices in the financial district, a room with a long mahogany table and framed prints of sailing vessels that I found oddly appropriate for a conversation about people navigating structures they had not fully mapped. David arrived with Warren Chu. My mother arrived separately, with our Aunt Renata, who had no legal standing in the meeting but whose presence David had apparently felt was useful. I arrived with Patricia Lim. The expression on David's face when Patricia walked in behind me is one I will carry for the rest of my life, not because it gave me pleasure, but because it was the clearest possible evidence of the degree to which he had constructed a version of this meeting that did not include the possibility that I had prepared. Warren Chu recovered faster. "He is a professional," he said. "I see you've brought counsel. Excellent. Let's make sure we're all working from the same documents." A folder on the table. Patricia placed a larger folder on the table. Dr. Alvarez's 42-page forensic accounting report was on top. Warren looked at the report. He looked at Patricia. He said, "I don't believe we've received this." Patricia said, "You will now." She slid a copy across the table. David said, "Claire, I really didn't think we needed to make this so formal." I kept my hands flat on the table. I looked at David and then at my mother and then back at David. I said, "A certified letter from an estate attorney asking me to reduce my beneficiary share by potentially $80,000 is formal, David." I responded accordingly. Renata started to say something. Patricia Lim said, quietly and without any particular emphasis, "I'm sorry, Ms. Hendricks, I don't believe you have a role in these proceedings. Would you like to step out or would you prefer to remain as an observer?" Renata looked at David. David said nothing. Renata remained as an observer. Warren Chu opened the meeting formally. He presented David's position. The restructuring was necessary, temporary, and in the long-term interest of the trust. He cited the anticipated recovery provisions. He cited precedent for intrafamily trust accommodations. He cited our mother's existing signature as an indicator of family consensus. Patricia Lim let him finish. Then she opened Dr. Alvarez's report to page 17 and said, "The forensic accounting analysis commissioned by my client identifies a material discrepancy between the recovery projections in your restructuring proposal and the actual market conditions in the relevant property sector. The gap between projected and realistic recovery is estimated at between $31,000 and $45,000. I'd like to understand how your client intends to address that discrepancy." Warren Chu said he would need time to review the report. Patricia said, "Of course. While you do, I'd like to address the 3 loan disbursements made from the trust's liquid reserves between February of last year and this past August, totaling $67,400, which were not disclosed to my client as a beneficiary in any formal communication. She placed a separate document on the table, the financial disclosure history from Grant Kowalski, with the 3 loan entries highlighted. That was the first document. I had 3 more. David's voice changed. Not dramatically, there was no outburst, no accusation, nothing that could be characterized as a loss of control. It was something subtler, the particular flatness that enters a voice when the person using it has run out of prepared lines. He said, "Those were bridge loans. Grant knew about them." Patricia said, "Grant approved them with your mother's signature. He did not disclose them to all beneficiaries as required under Section 14 of the trust agreement." She turned to page 4 of the trust documents, the original 26 pages I had read on a Saturday morning 14 months earlier, and slid it across the table. The relevant paragraph was highlighted in yellow. Warren Chu read it. His expression remained professionally controlled, but I had been in compliance work long enough to recognize the specific stillness of someone identifying a problem they had not anticipated. David put down his pen. His hands went still on the table. I said nothing. I had said what I needed to say. Patricia continued. The second document was the financial disclosure in full, all 12 months of trust account activity, which revealed not only the 3 loan disbursements but a pattern of fee structures that Dr. Alvarez's report described as inconsistent with the stated investment objectives of the trust and potentially adverse to the interests of minority beneficiaries. The third document was Patricia's formal legal objection to the proposed restructuring, filed that morning with the relevant probate registry, which meant that the restructuring could not proceed without either my agreement or a court order. The fourth document was a letter from Daniel Reyes at Whitmore Reyes and Associates, addressed to Warren Chu personally, noting that should the trust matter proceed to formal dispute, there were additional questions about the original loan disclosures that might warrant examination under the state's fiduciary liability statutes. Warren Chu read the letter from Daniel Reyes. He set it down. He looked at David. He said, "I'd like a brief recess." They took 15 minutes. When they came back, Warren Chu's posture had reorganized itself around a different set of objectives. He said that David was open to discussing alternatives to the proposed restructuring. Patricia said she was glad to hear it. My mother, who had been quiet for the entirety of the meeting, said, "Claire, I didn't know it was this complicated." I looked at her, at the woman who had spent my entire adult life asking whether I was sure things were realistic, and I said, "I know, Mom. That's what I was here for." Renata, from her seat at the far end of the table, said nothing. She was looking at the stack of documents in front of Patricia Lim with an expression I recognized. It was the same expression Gerald Koss had worn in Conference Room B at Mercer Valiant, in the moment before he made his comment about planning. It was recognition. Not of me, exactly. Of the fact that something had been built in a place they had not thought to look. The resolution took 6 weeks. Patricia Lim and Warren Chu negotiated a formal agreement that preserved my beneficiary share at its original allocation, established a repayment schedule for the $67,400 in undisclosed loan disbursements, and required that any future trust modifications be submitted to all 3 beneficiaries with a mandatory 30-day review period before any action could be taken. The agreement was signed by all parties and filed with the probate registry as a court order. It was specific, it was documented, it was witnessed. David signed it on a Thursday afternoon. I was not in the room when he signed. Patricia represented me at the final execution. She called me afterward and said, "It's done." I said, "Thank you." She said, "You made this possible. You had everything we needed before I asked for it." I said, "I learned early that the documentation is the difference between having been right and being able to prove it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That should be in a textbook somewhere." The federal audit at Mercer Valiant concluded 8 weeks after that Thursday. The firm received a formal compliance remediation order, a structured set of requirements for improving its security documentation practices, rather than the punitive enforcement action that had been the alternative. Harriet Ose told me the regulatory representative had cited my production package, specifically as evidence that the firm had demonstrated good faith compliance awareness, even where individual supervisory failures had occurred. Gerald Koss was not reinstated. His LinkedIn profile updated to independent IT consultant 3 months later. My contract with Mercer Valiant was renewed with a title elevation to Vice President of Compliance and a salary adjustment to $168,000 annually. The health insurance coverage package remained the same, comprehensive, with full coverage for specialist appointments, and a clear insurance policy structure that I had actually read in its entirety, which I recommended to everyone on my team. I told them, know what your documents say. Know what the insurance policy covers. Keep your medical records accessible and current. These are not bureaucratic obligations, they are instruments of your own agency. Priya Subramaniam, who had since been promoted to managing director at Audit, sent me a congratulatory message when the promotion was announced. She wrote, I knew from the Hartwell report, I just didn't know how far you'd go. I wrote back, neither did I, but I kept the documentation. Dr. Felicia Morrow published a second edition of her compliance framework methodology the following year. My name was in the acknowledgement section. It was not a single line in a fourth paragraph this time. It was a full sentence. I have thought about this story many times in the years since, not obsessively, but in the way you think about something that shaped the architecture of how you move through the world. I have thought about Gerald Koss, who dismissed me not out of malice precisely, but out of the particular laziness of a man who had never needed to take anyone else's precision seriously. I have thought about David, who is not a villain, I want to be honest about that, but a person who had grown so accustomed to operating inside a family narrative where I was the uncertain one, the difficult one, the paranoid one, that he genuinely could not model a version of events in which I had prepared more thoroughly than he had. That blindness cost him. It cost my mother something too, though she has never said so directly. I think about Renata saying, battle you can't win, and I think that she believed it when she said it. I think most of the people who told me versions of that sentence believed it. That is not comfort exactly, but it is true, and I have found that truth is more useful to me than comfort in most circumstances. What I know is this. I went to dinner by myself the evening Patricia called to tell me the trust agreement had been signed. The same restaurant where I had sat alone when I was promoted to director, the one I had been meaning to try for 2 years. I ordered the same thing. I sat at the bar. I did not read anything. I did not check my phone. I sat for 45 minutes, and I thought about a parking structure on a Thursday afternoon, and a savings account with $11,400, and a piece of paper folded in a wallet and a 61-page report that a woman named Priya Subramaniam had emailed me about on a Sunday morning, and the specific sensation of a plan meeting reality and deciding to continue anyway. And if there's anything this experience taught me, it's this. 1. The most powerful thing you can do in the face of dismissal is to go quiet, go deep, and build something so thorough that when the moment comes, there is nothing left for them to argue with. 2. Documentation is not paranoia. It is the only instrument that transforms what you know into what you can prove. And in every institution that matters, proof is the currency that does not depreciate. 3. Your identity does not belong to the people who formed their opinion of you before you became who you are. And you are not required to correct them in real time, because the record will do it for you when it matters. Was I wrong to keep my preparations completely hidden from my family for over a year while they moved forward assuming I would not respond? Tell me in the comments. If this story gave you strength, hit that like button. It means more than you know.